Joined now by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who's a former US National Security Advisor and also author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. Good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. And I just thought, first of all, this doesn't seem to be going terribly well for Vladimir Putin. Do you think he has badly miscalculated here?
Mark, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the reporting you're doing from Ukraine. I think he's failed already. I mean, if his goals were, as reported, to subjugate all of Ukraine, to do it quickly, to do it without much of a fight, to think that Ukrainians' leaders were going to flee, to think that the Ukrainian people wouldn't fight courageously as we've seen them fight, then yes, he was completely wrong. And I think he underestimated the Ukrainians, and I think it's pretty clear he overestimated the capability of his own military. Now, that's not to say that, of course, as you know all too well, Mark, that the Ukrainian people aren't bearing the brunt of this, that they aren't suffering tremendously from how Russia's adapted to that failure, which is to inflict more and more casualties on the Ukrainian people, to target the civilian populations with this indiscriminate bombing and use of artillery and rockets.
Yeah, I mean, that's undoubtedly true. But what about Putin, do you think? He seems to be isolated. He seems to have no one that is able to talk to him, or at least willing to tell him the truth. I mean, how dangerous do you think Putin's state of mind might be?
I think it's already clear that it's dangerous, right? But it's not new that Putin is dangerous, right? He's been a murderer. He's murdered journalists. He's tried to assassinate with banned nerve agents a political opponent, a former KGB agent in Salisbury, as you know all too well. He's enabled the serial episodes of mass homicide, which are the Syrian civil war. He invaded Georgia in 2008. He invaded Ukraine in 2014. So it's not as if this is an aberrational event. But of course, he's become increasingly dangerous, I think, Mark, because of these assumptions that he's made. He assumed that the West was weak. He assumed that Ukraine wouldn't fight. And I think what he's finding is the assumptions on which he based his decisions were quite inaccurate. He, and I would add Xi Jinping into that, his best friend, self-declared for both of them best friends, and the 5,000-word statement they issued just before the Olympics, and the phone call they had 24 hours before Putin inflicted these horrors on the Ukrainian people.
Do you think his senior generals go along with what he's doing here, or do you think, is it time someone in the Kremlin took him out?
Well, it's time for a change, right? I mean, he's dragging the Russian people down too. And so you would hope that the Russian people, and you've seen the protests, but of course they haven't been able to coalesce because they've been put down brutally inside of Russia. But, Vladimir Putin loves to appear strong, doesn't he? He likes to ride shirtless on horseback. But you know what? He's not very strong right now, I don't think, Mark. I mean, you have to realize, obviously, that there are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were during the height of the Cold War. That there are more people in Russia's internal security services than there are in Russia's military. So, those aren't signs of strength, I don't think. Now, I don't understand what's going on inside the Kremlin. I don't think anybody does. But we can only hope that there would be a change of leadership, and maybe even leadership who recognize that the future of the Russian people lies with Europe, right? Lies with peace and the prosperity that the Russian people could experience, if they put down the sword, and instead focused on their own future.
Do you think, General, that NATO may eventually be drawn into this war?
I think it's a very strong possibility, Mark. I think the chance for a broader war in Europe is significant. And we're talking a lot about the aerospace domain and the need to challenge it in the maritime domains. But of course, this war is already affecting all the neighboring countries with the massive refugee flow. And the estimates are that could grow to 10 million people. So I think, Mark, it's already a broader war. Right? These wars, as you know, they don't stop at boundaries. The Syrian civil war didn't stop at Syria's boundary. And so I think we have to recognize that the chances of an expansion of the conflict are quite high. And, of course, Putin's been aggressive, beyond Ukraine, right? As I mentioned, he's invaded Georgia, but he's also weaponized refugees on Poland's border. He's encouraging Serbian separatist movements in the Balkans, right? He's conducted massive cyber attacks. So I think that, that we have to be prepared, for an expansion of this war. We ought to try to do everything we can to avoid it. We have to do everything also to ensure that Russia fails in Ukraine, because if he succeeds there, it's not the end.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that we should do everything we can to avoid it, but we've just, while you were speaking there, had pictures on the screen, General, of all the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the country, the desperate images of families torn apart. Is there at all a moral, humanitarian case for actually getting involved now and doing something?
Absolutely. And I think that we have to obviously demonstrate that we have the will and the capability to do so, to impose what some people are recommending, right? Safe zones and humanitarian corridors. But also we have to pull out all the stops on providing the Ukrainians with the defensive capabilities they need. Now, there's a lot of talk about MiG fighters. Okay, do it. How about medium range air defense weapons? How about more drone capabilities? Because as the Russians pull their artillery and their rockets into these bastions that they want to use to rubble European cities, hey, we have to help the Ukrainians do something about that, but also we have to really raise our voices loudly across the free world for the establishment of a safe maritime corridor to Odessa, for example. And so I really think that the time is now to pull out really all the stops. And I know that you've been reporting, on what could happen in the hydrocarbon sector if there are sanctions. But hey, I think we all have to be prepared to pay some price to help the Ukrainians who are paying, the ultimate price, sadly, right now, and to interrupt the cash flows to Putin that fund his war machine.
Right. Just finally, because we've run out of time, but you're saying we should impose a no-fly zone and some sort of maritime zone as well. Is that what you're saying?
We have to be quite transparent about this with the Russians, right? And we have to, build the capability to do it. I think we'll have to tell him that it's our intention, unless he stops the mass homicide in Ukraine, that we're going to have to act. And so the alternative, Mark, I know, of course, there's a tremendous risk of action. We always focus on that, and quite rightly. But there's a cost of inaction, too. And I think we're seeing that now. Are we going to watch what some estimates are that 1 million people will be murdered by Russian forces as he continues to bombard these cities?
But he said if anybody interfered, that they would face, and I'm quoting here, consequences that you have never encountered in your history.
Well, it's a not veiled threat, right, of nuclear war. But what is Putin left with, right? He has economy that's in shambles. His military can't fight effectively. They can bombard innocent civilians, but they can't fight effectively. So what is he left with? He's left with a cyber threat, and he's left with a nuclear threat. And of course, we have to take these seriously, but I don't think we ought to use his threats as an excuse for inaction, right? We have to take responsible action. We have to act together. We have to generate the will, and we have to be quite clear to Putin that what our intentions are. And of course, none of this, the war right now is not without risk, right? Ask the Ukrainians, who I know you are asking them, and you're with them now.
Yeah. Well, listen, General McMaster, very interesting stuff. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Mark.